Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in the early modern period, moving into the reign of Pope 209, Callistus III, reigned from 1455 to 1458. The conclave of 1455, like all the previous ones, had many issues to consider. What to do about the Turks, who had just conquered Constantinople, what to do with the thousands of Greek refugees fleeing their homeland because they did not want to live under Islam, what to do about the perpetually feuding Italian families, all of whom devoted vast effort at each conclave to control the papacy. None of the powerful houses could gain a majority of votes, which meant a compromise candidate. Their choice fell on a 77-year-old Spanish cardinal named Alfonso de Borgia. Now, Borgia sounds familiar. It's not because of this guy, but it is the same family. So a relative of his is going to become the famous one, Alexander VI. But this one's Alfonso de Alfonso then D.E. Borgia, B-O-R-G-I-A. His age, 77, meant a short pontificate. Ethnically, he was not Italian, so belonged to none of the rival houses. Since he had grown up with Spain, he had long experience fighting Muslims, as Spain had been occupied, at least parts of it had been occupied by Islam since the year 711, as we covered in the late patristics and then repeated in the early medieval playlist. And personally, he had diplomatic experience. He was an interesting blend of traits from his three predecessors. He had, personally, the way he lived with the simplicity of Pope Eugenius IV. He had the legal training, as well as the penchant for nepotism, of Pope Martin V, and he had the diplomatic flair of Pope Nicholas V. He was born in Valencia, Spain, on December 31st, 1378, into a family of poor but independent farmers. Meaning they had no title. They did own their land, but they had no title. He studied law at Lerida, impressed the faculty, so he got a job teaching there after he graduated. Lerida was a natural recruiting ground for the royal court, and Alfonso's talent soon resulted in his appointment as one of the secretaries to King Alphonsus V of Aragon, who reigned from 1416 to 1458. Alfonso de Borgia, the guy who becomes Pope Callistus, was also a deeply religious person. And whenever matters of policy between Aragon and the Holy See came up, he was always found to be on the pro-papal side, even if at times that did result in a career setback for him. Eventually, he was rewarded. He was appointed and ordained Bishop of Valencia, his hometown, in 1429, in which capacity he negotiated the alliance between King Alfonso of Aragon and Pope Eugenius IV that was crucial to the survival of Eugenius at the time when so many Italians were trying to kill him, and when he was actually living, he couldn't even be in Rome, he was living in exile in Florence. Eugenius rewarded Bishop Alfonso by appointing him to the College of Cardinals in 1443. Though a cardinal, Alfonso preferred to remain in his own diocese of Valencia, Spain. As the years passed, he became increasingly austere, arranging his residence in Valencia along monastic lines, insofar as that was possible for the center of a large Catholic diocese. He showed absolutely zero interest in the artistic movement associated with the Renaissance, and when confronted with it, was uniformly negative. When he accepted election as the 209th Pope on April 8, 1455, he took as his papal name Callistus, third of that name. He was already crippled by arthritis. He was unable to walk or stand for long periods. He knew that he had only a few years left to him, so devoted his pontificate to one initiative, Islam. Callistus believed that liberating Constantinople from the Ottoman Turks was feasible. He felt that fighting to achieve this met the conditions for a just war on the grounds of self-defense, because Constantinople had never been a Turkish or an Islamic city. It was constructed by Constantine I, who of course was the first Christian emperor. In this case, the Turks had clearly been the aggressors, because the Byzantine Greeks posed absolutely no military threat to them by that point in history. Once in control of the city, the Turks had stolen churches, notably Hagia Sophia, and denied them to the faithful by converting them to mosques. Now, the Turks regarded this as their right of conquest, but Callistus regarded it as grounds for a just war. He announced that the counterattack would begin on March 1st, 1456, only 11 months after his election. He called for a tithe from the Universal Church to pay for this, another crusade. He set a personal example. He proceeded to sell off works of Renaissance art collected by his predecessor, Nicholas V, painting, sculpture, precious metal objects, even books. He immediately halted the grand building projects of Nicholas V that had not been completed, and diverted that money and labor to building a fleet and equipping an army. The University of Paris objected to this, calling a crusade. So they called for a general council, another church council, and let the council decide if Christendom believed a crusade was justified. The University of Heidelberg in Germany also argued that the Pope could not impose an additional tithe on the Universal Church without the consent of the Universal Church through a council. Both French and German scholars argued that the clerical hierarchy of each country should be responsible for making decisions that affected the faithful of that nation, such as going on a crusade. This reveals that Gallicanism, the ecclesiology of Gallicanism, declared that French royal policy had been declared as French royal policy by the Pragmatic Sanction of Bruges in 1438, was still ascendant in France, and that it had spread to at least the academic circles in Germany. Callistus did not live long enough to respond, and in any case was too occupied with his crusade. He appointed a papal commission to reopen the case of St. Joan, well, she wasn't a saint yet, but Jeanne d'Arc, murdered, as we covered previously, murdered by incineration, executed by incineration at Rouen on May 30th, 1431, after a British-controlled French ecclesiastical court conducted a drumhead trial which convicted her of witchcraft and heresy. When first accused, she had appealed to the Holy See, but Pope Martin V had just died when she did it, and the new pope had not been elected, and of course the British were not about to let her go regardless. On June 16, 1456, following the recommendation of that commission, Pope Callistus nullified the conviction of Jeanne d'Arc, declaring that the trial had been irregular in procedure and in any case had failed to establish the facts of the charges made against her. Meanwhile, in terms of the crusade, the Ottoman Sultan, Muhammad the Conqueror, the same guy who had conquered Constantinople, was, in fact, he wasn't waiting to be attacked. He was marching his army up the Danube River Valley, an army of 80,000 troops with 300 cannon. Marching up the Danube, that would take him to Budapest in Hungary, Belgrade in Serbia, Vienna, Austria. The Pope's military force, which was supposed to go on crusade to liberate Constantinople, but this was a more immediate problem. The Pope's military force was commanded by a Hungarian general named Jan Hunyadi, Hunyadi, who lived from 1407 to 1456. An Italian Franciscan, subsequently canonized, so Saint John Capistrano, lived from 1386 to 1456, He was the senior army chaplain. The Christian army decided to make their stand at Belgrade in present-day Serbia. Just wait for the Turks to come. It was following the Danube River. It was going to take them to Serbia. And they arrived just in time. Then they were attacked by the Turkish army in July of 1456. The Turkish artillery, the cannons, the giant cannons, shattered the walls of Belgrade, just as they had the walls of Constantinople. The Turkish troops poured into the city, and then it became street-to-street fighting. The Christians in the city fought for every street, every building, because they had heard what happened at Constantinople, so they figured they'd be killed anyway. There were two differences between this siege of Belgrade and that of Constantinople 3 years earlier. First difference, the Turkish army was much smaller, 80,000 troops as opposed to 150,000 troops. Second, and connected to that, because of that, tactically, the Turks were not able to completely interdict the city. They could not completely cut off the city. So Belgrade, as a river city, could be resupplied from up the Danube River, which the Turks did not control. So the Turks were attacking from downriver going up, but supplies could still come from upriver. Once the Islamic army was in the city, they could not be supported by their cannon. So after a period of horrific fighting, hand-to-hand, the Turks, who were outnumbered once they got in the city, and certainly on the streets they were outnumbered, within each street that they were fighting, they retreated to their camp. Then the Christians, even though they were exhausted, they saw this as their only opportunity. So the Christians rushed from the city and to the Turkish camp in a manic rage, and then it was just hacking, just everybody hacking at each other. It was the kind of frenzy that only mortal terror can instill. And when it was done, 30,000 bodies littered the landscape. Even the Sultan had been wounded by an arrow. He survived, though, and the Turks retreated. But the rotting corpses, because they couldn't bury 30,000 corpses, served as a vector for an outbreak of pestilence, probably cholera, that wiped out the surviving population of the city, including both the general, Jan Hunyadi, as well as the senior chaplain, St. John Capistrano. In commemoration of this victory, which was not only a protection for Belgrade, but also everything upriver, which means Europe, southeastern Europe, Pope Callistus declared that the Feast of the Transfiguration of Christ was to be celebrated on August 6th by the Universal Church, and the feast is still observed on that day. Now, the original event of the Transfiguration is recorded in the Gospels, Matthew chapter 17, Mark chapter 9, and Luke chapter 9. The following year, August of 1457, the ships, the fleet of Pope Callistus, assembled for the crusade, engaged and sank, not the entire Turkish fleet, but a substantial squadron in a battle off the coast of the island of Lesbos in the Aegean Sea. Because he did not have the support of all the secular powers of Europe, and because his army had been wiped out by the cholera outside of Belgrade, Pope Callistus did not have sufficient resources to follow up that victory with an assault on Constantinople, which was the whole point of this crusade. His navy did liberate thousands of Christians who had been enslaved by the Turks during their conquest and were sold and had been enslaved on the island. And then the Pope died soon after, so that meant whatever, it's not known what his subsequent strategy would have been. Now, despite his many good qualities, Pope Callistus did share the perennial vice of feudalism, and that is nepotism, helping his relatives by appointing them to high church positions, regardless of vocation. Now, this, as we've seen, was habitual in Italy, as well as in all the kingdoms. But Callistus was Spanish, ethnically Spanish, so Spaniards were being given authority, church positions in Italy, authority over Italians. So here we have the ethnic hatred come back. This was bitterly resented. One such appointment was naming one of his nephews Rodrigo Borgia, appointing him a cardinal at the age of 25 and making him vice-chancellor of the Curia in Rome. This man would later become the 214th pope, the infamous Alexander VI, elected in 1492. But we have a few popes to cover before we get to him. Pope Callistus died, coincidentally, on a subsequent Feast of the Transfiguration, August 6, 1458. He was followed as Pope 210 by Pope Pius II, and it is to him we will turn next time. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.